Hello, good evening, and welcome once again to this edition of HT Auto Live. Over the last several weeks, we've spoken about cars, two-wheelers, the automotive industry as a whole. So basically, we've spoken about the dish, the cook, the restaurant, but we've not spoken about the ingredients, and components are the real ingredients of the vehicular industry in India. So today, to tell us more about the Indian component manufacturers and what's been happening there, we're joined by Mr. Deepak Jain. He's president of ACMA. Mr. Jain, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time out.
Thank you, Shubha, for having me, and thank you for a lovely introduction about the dish being basically the ones which are components which actually make the vehicles.
Yes, ingredients, fresh ingredients are what are needed for a perfect dish, and components are actually the soul of vehicles and may not always get the credit, because when we go out to buy vehicles or to look at vehicles, we look at it as a whole, but there are so many things that make that vehicle. Tell us a little bit more about ACMA and what does it stand for and the objectives.
So ACMA is the Automotive Component Manufacturing Association of India. And it actually has about 850 members, which actually represent the organized sector, almost about 80% of the manufacturing which are doing the components. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, we actually do a revenue, if I take the base year as 1890, of almost about 57 billion US dollars. And just to give you another perspective, we're almost contributing 25% to the manufacturing GDP. Of course, all the suppliers are mainly to our esteemed customers, the OEMs, and collectively the auto industry per se is about 120 billion US dollars, or then actually doing 50% of the manufacturing GDP. So if you see our Honorable Prime Minister's call to make India as a $5 trillion economy, we need to actually grow the manufacturing to be almost about 1 trillion of value add. And in that sense, the auto industry and the auto component industry would have to play an extremely critical role for the future of India as well.
Right. Fair to say then that the fate of the automotive industry rests as much on the component manufacturers as the car manufacturers itself, the big car companies and the two-wheelers. It's not been good going for the automotive industry as a whole since 2019, and any promise of 2020 bringing with it hope has been diminished by the coronavirus. How difficult have the last several weeks been for the component manufacturers in particular?
So let me say with a hint of optimism, we have actually faced earlier downturns as well. It's not the first downturn which the industry is facing, and it's not going to be the last downturn as well. But yes, it does, especially the COVID, complicate the matter, because when we actually went into the financial year with 1920, so we actually degrew and contracted almost about 18% as an industry. And of course, the financial year, April, we were under a lockdown. And just to again give a sense, when we were in the lockdown, the per day revenue loss for the industry was almost close to 2,300 crores, in which the components was contributing about 1,200 crores per day. So of course, it was not a very nice start. The financial year's April month started with almost a zero revenue. We are actually now inching forward. The Q1, if you see, we actually almost, compared to last quarter one, declined almost 80%. So we've just performed 20%. But there are certain green shoots which are there. And we feel that we are resilient. We have the wherewithal to actually even weather this COVID as a storm, and hopefully in the future go back to where we were.
Right. But there have been several factors besides all the challenges that COVID itself has posed. There have been several factors at play even before COVID outbreak happened. For example, there was the question of BS4 to BS6 transition. There was a lack of, say, liquidity. Without getting into too much of jargon about the business angle of it, all of those things that existed, coupled with the COVID-related circumstances, and then there was this whole India-China tension, which has subsided in recent days, in recent weeks, but still somewhere it's there. And a lot of components, correct me if I'm wrong, India is still dependent on China, also in the automotive sphere. So how big a concern is that?
Yeah, so as you rightly said, that there were certain challenges which we were already facing. See, the auto component industry or the supply chain is extremely interdependent, complex, as well as global supply chain. And the problem is that you cannot make a car with 99 parts. You need the whole 100% supply chain to be active and to deliver the right quality on the right time to ensure that you actually make a valid vehicle. So, of course, you had this whole fast tracking of this emission norms, which was from BS4 to BS6. I think India did it in 3 years. And of course, with this transition, what happens is the prices on the vehicles actually went up because there was new regulations which came in. There were safety emission norms which had to be put in the system. But also another way, the industry did not get the adequate time to test the vehicle. So you actually had to depend a lot on imports of components. And these were critical components, engine or as well as electronic components. China, you see, is actually having a global supply chain. It actually has become the factory to the world before COVID. And China-India dependency on the component space, if you see, is that we actually import close to about $17 billion, and of which $4.5 billion come from China. So almost a quarter of imports is coming from China. But if I look at in the total value chain of about 120 billion, it's just about 4%. So 4% of the parts are coming in from China. But as I said, even if one part is short, so you just cannot make a vehicle. And this is the exact problem which currently also we are facing, is having sustainable production runs, because we are still having plants all across India in the auto hubs. Typically, if you see, every OEM, a vehicle manufacturer, will have hundreds of, let's say, auto component makers supplying to them. And these 100 component makers would, across India, supply from various parts of India, even globally, to that vehicle manufacturer. So you see that in this scenario, even let's say in today's COVID situation, if you have one area in lockdown, or in a China situation, if a supply chain gets disrupted because of this whole geopolitical tension, we're not able to actually make sustainable production. So that's the current challenge today.
Right, but there is a call and has been a Make in India call, and now there is an Atmanirbharta call in India. What are the challenges? Is it possible for us to actually reduce greatly our dependence on China, or for that matter, other foreign markets for components? I believe you said in one of your previous interviews that in certain areas like, say, engine parts and electronics, India is still lacking some sense of competence. Do you see that as a roadblock? How do we address those issues? Is there a need to actually reduce dependence on foreign countries, especially China?
I think clearly, this whole COVID situation has taught us that as a supply chain, you cannot be over-dependent on any one region. So today, everyone is talking about a China plus one strategy. Now, let's also understand why people are sourcing from China. It is not just because of love of China, but China does offer affordable quality, competitive solutions across the world. And hence, as an ecosystem, we are actually basically importing from China. Now, the auto industry per se has always been a champion of localization, or in a way, Atmanirbhar. We have had vehicles which actually have got extremely high levels of indigenization, almost 90% plus. Of course, with the technology regulations and shift, also in a fast track moment, we had to import from actually foreign countries. But hopefully, we will also localize that. But I think the key factor is competitiveness. And of course, there are certain disabilities when you're actually manufacturing in India. That's no secret. But I think with this whole government industry partnership, if we really want to look at scale and export, we have to make our domestic manufacturing extremely competitive on a global scale and also on a global index.
Right. But is it happening is the big question. I'll tell you why that question, though. is because off the record, I was speaking to a top official of one of the car makers, major car makers in India. And because it was off the record, I obviously can't name the company or the official, but he told me that there is a sense of several sense of roadblock, whether it's in terms of permissions that need to be received, bureaucratic hurdles. So it's very easy for us to say Atmanirbharta and make in India, but to actually translate it from saying it to actually doing it is not a walk in the park. Would you agree with that?
So, Shiva, I'll give this analogy, right? And this has been always an issue of India. It's not today. You're talking about the issues. It's always been there. And probably in before, they've been much more complex. So let's talk about the auto industry per se. Now, motorcycles. We are the world's largest manufacturers of motorcycles. There are indigenized local Indian players who are actually not only producing the world's best quality motorcycles, but also they have defended their turf from China or any other basically foreign players for their domestic industry, and now have the whereabouts to actually go global. And they're actually going and dominating at the world stage. Now, you have the same problems of, let's say, land, logistics, all the other hurdles which you just talked about. But the point is that there is an industry which has actually done it. So we really need to go and understand where and how they've been able to do competitiveness. And as a component as an auto industry, we actually have to see quality, competitiveness in terms of cost, and also innovation and R&D. Unless we have that as an ecosystem, we would not be able to compete globally for any product category. And I think this is where have been our learnings. We have been in dialogue with the government as well. And I think government also understands very well the need to enhance the competitiveness. And as I said, that manufacturing, if India has to grow, will have to play a very crucial role to do that. And I think we are at least confident that this is a listening government. We are engaged. They're also looking at certain champion sectors to see how they can actually promote exports and competitiveness. But key is we have to have a long-term stable plan to keep on enhancing India's competitiveness at a global level. And with that only, we will be able to dominate certain markets.
Right. Fair enough. Also, ACMA had recently said that there are certain supply chain issues because goods being imported from China specifically are being subjected to manual inspection. What is that all about, and has that been sorted now?
So fortunately, we made a representation and a request to the authorities, and it had been sorted. I think there was a week's delay. The concern there was that, we actually live in a just-in-time world. The supply chains are very efficient, and any disruption there. And unfortunately, with the lockdown, the supply chains did get disrupted. The learning was that we can easily lock down and can stop everything. But to restart, it takes a lot more effort. Currently, I think the problems are threefold. One is the availability of manpower. You already know the issues with migrant labor. And as basically the volumes pick up, we would need basically the same kind of labor intensity at the factories and auto clusters. Second, I think it's also the raw material. It's also not just from China, but our tier 2s, tier 3s, because as I said, it's an integrated, highly complex and interdependent supply chain. And third is, of course, money. We have had losses. Cash flow has been an issue. The government has given certain moratoriums, but it's a relief. It has not actually just been, a moratorium. It's not that they have actually said that you are able to absorb. So coming September and October, you will see that the payments will get due, and you'll again have certain cash flow issues. So this is a concern going forward in sustainable production lines.
Right. But there has also been a sort of request slash demand that the auto industry should be deemed essential services. There is a lot that countries like, say, France, Germany, UK are doing to help out, to bail out the auto industry. I understand India is not a France, it's not a Germany, it's not a UK, but is deeming the auto industry an essential service, essential business, actually, is it a solution to a lot of woes that the industry is facing currently?
I think the essential services need from the sector came across because of having a sustainable production run. During the lockdown, only essential services were allowed. And as I said, that supply chain is highly complex and integrated. And if one portion stops, one element of the supply chain stops, the whole supply chain stops. And hence the intent was essential services. Today, at least, I'm happy to state that even in states where there are, again, talks of having a lockdown, the industry at least has been allowed to function. And that is actually a step in the right direction. But I think the key for the industry demand, it's been a long pending demand, has been on demand generation. Today, we've got supply chains ready to that certain extent with the challenges, but I think the government must do something more to actually create demand, to create consumer confidence, because unless the demand is generated, there will be these same problems coming again and again.
You sort of touched upon two of my next questions in just one go, which is fantastic, but I'll ask you to elaborate on these factors, the point about demand, because we've spoken about manufacturing in India, about supply chain issues, but all of these would perhaps come to absolutely nothing if there is no demand, and current projections are not that great, frankly. Some of the reports that we have say that there is likely to be a 35% decline in sales across vehicles of all categories in the times to come, and vehicle sales dropped 18% in FY20. Clearly, people are not prioritizing going to a showroom or even logging on to digital platforms and buying vehicles. So, how does the industry as a whole deal with a situation where even if manufacturing is back on track at some point in time, if supply chains are absolutely in place, there is no demand? How does the industry deal with that? And what are the expectations? If I may just plug in one more question, what can the industry do and what can the government do in this case?
I think clearly let's talk about the industry per se first, because we need to do our own bit. I think the industry needs to get more competitive, and we are actually for demand creation generation looking at solutions. I think we've seen OEMs, the vehicle manufacturers offer more warranty. They're going on to digital platforms. They're actually providing much more better financing solutions, and trying to actually entice the consumer coming back. But I think what is also understood and needs to be understood in the right context, that the auto industry is one of the most heavily taxed industry. A vehicle is still considered, and we're taxed at almost the same category as a sin's good. And I think that's been the request of the industry to the government for a long time, that we need to rationalize the GST. We need to rationalize the duty structure. Even at the components level, almost about 40% of the components still actually attract 28%. 60% are doing 18%. So we need to rationalize the taxation structure, and the government before has actually done it in 2008. It's actually done it 2013. History has taught us that wherever we have had at that time excise duty reductions, and hopefully now a GST reduction, there is buoyancy in demand. We understand that the government also has concerns on the revenue, and we completely agree, but we are looking at a short-term, like a steroid injection. You need a short-term, basically, intervention to at least boost the consumer confidence coming in. Of course, also one clear request to the government has been the long-pending scrappage policy. And the scrappage policy has been in the framework. We are hoping that they announce soon. Because for that, it's not just demand creation, but also environment friendly, because it will take away a lot of the vehicles, which are the old vehicles on the roads. So these have been the two long pending, requests. And I think it is a right time to actually intervene by the government.
I just cut you short there. Demand to actually rationalize taxes is, there's a school of thought which says that, if the government did not do it for all these times, and you yourself said it's been a long standing, long pending demand. There's a school of thought which says that if the government did not do it thus far, in current times, with revenue generation being absolutely crucial for the government itself, there is absolutely no chance of it happening. Would you agree with that?
Well, as I said, Ami said that's a choice which the government needs to make. Let us say 0 of 28% is still 0. And I mean, say if there is some growth and you reduce that, so you have to see a cost benefit analysis on it. We, at least as an industry, are quite confident that if you reduce certain element of basically the taxation and boost the generation, you actually probably going to come up and end up having more revenue. And that's what the calculation and methodology we are basically saying. And we absolutely understand the challenges in the country today on revenue generation. But we need to start this step. Now, let me give a focus sector, which is the agriculture sector. The tractor industry has had a buoyant growth, even in COVID times. And there were two things. One was that it was actually deemed as an essential services because it was agriculture related. Second, the government has done a lot of interventions to the farmers. And third, there has been a great monsoon, so they've actually had a good crop. With this, there has been a disposable income to the farmers. And we see that they are spending, and there is actually is more tractor sales, which means more revenue to the government. And it's the same logic we would like to apply for a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler industry, so that we are able to at least have, for an interim period, some demand regeneration.
Right. Yes, sales coming from the rural sector is actually, provides a glimmer of hope. But you've given us a fairly exhaustive idea of what the industry as a whole and the competent manufacturers are facing and what may lie ahead. What are the expectations? Yes, final question, and it's an interesting one. There has been so much talk about electric vehicles. Now, this is away from all the questions that I've asked you thus far. There's been so much talk about electric vehicles, and there is clearly, the world over, so much emphasis being given on electric vehicles, so many predictions being made about how EVs are now going to replace cars and two-wheelers as we've known. The revolution of EVs, how does it impact? What does it mean for automotive component makers?
I think the EV trend globally is there. And I think India also must play its very important role in actually securing its place in the electrification or the XEV revolution which the world is playing. Now, from that point of view, I think we need to understand very clearly that we have an opportunity here to leapfrog and actually become technology leaders. But for doing that, we need is a very stable and a sustainable long-term roadmap on technology, on phased manufacturing, and on localization incentives, so that we are also able to become, if not number one, but at least the top 3 in the electric vehicle mobility revolution, even in the component levels. And I think as components, of course, the number of components reduce, but actually the value addition actually may increase from that point of view. So I think from that perspective, at least ACMA believes in all technologies, not just EVs, but all future mobility technologies. And we want to play our part, but we need to have a sustainable long-term regulatory roadmap along with the government and the private sector, so that we are able to invest in the right direction and also get onto the technology curve ahead of other competitors.
Right, but the number of components actually involved or used in an EV is significantly lesser than in a regular vehicle. Just today, Bloomberg had a report from Thailand which said a lot of auto component makers in the country, in Thailand, because of the the progress being made by EVs in that particular country, are now actually diversifying to manufacturing non-automotive equipment. Do you see something like that, some sort of a concern like that creeping into the Indian sphere as well?
I have a little diverse view on this, on a contrary view. I think the EV shift globally will actually give Indian auto component manufacturers a much bigger opportunity. And let me elaborate this one. Many of the component manufacturers in Europe, or probably in more mature developed economies, may not want to invest in the traditional auto components or engine or ICE components. And that's where where India has a lot of competitiveness, and if we have proven the quality factor as well in these component manufacturing, we would actually be able to supply to actually a larger world economic sphere on the ICE engines from here, and also parallelly develop the EV component ecosystem so that we are able to actually have a leap in the new mobilities as well.
Right. Right. So clearly, we've covered a lot in the last several minutes. You've given us a perspective of the component manufacturers, of the overall industry, and a look into the future and how India is at least at the cusp of things which are better than what they are today. Mr. Jain, thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Shiva. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you.